Okay, so what are the two definitions of gospel?
Good news.
Good news, that is right. Specifically, the good news about Jesus when we talk about it. When you say, I told someone the gospel, you probably don't mean a deal at Walmart. You mean the good news about Jesus. And is there another definition that you can think of?
The life of?
That is a very good guess. The life of? Because, what makes you guess that? I think genealogy. Because you hear people call Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John the Gospels, right? Yes. So, yeah, it means those four books. That's a secondary definition, though. So, how do you think the term gospel came to be a name for those four books? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the first four books in the New Testament.
They're all about Jesus.
Right. They're all about the good news. So, the original full title of the book of Matthew is the Gospel, what? According to Matthew. Not the Gospel of Matthew. The Gospel according to Matthew. Because there's only one Gospel. The Gospel of Jesus. So you could call it the good news about Jesus according to Matthew. Or a better way to say according to in modern vernacular would be the good news about Jesus as told by Matthew. So the same gospel, different authors for the different books about said gospel. Okay, are the gospels, now I'm using the secondary definition now, the gospels, the four books, are they history or literature? History? Anybody vote literature? Nobody. Well, what? Was that Debbie? It is both. The answer is both. Good job, Debbie. Way to be brave. Go against the current. Yes, they're both. It's very important. Now, of the two, history or literature, which is more important? The history of these books or the literature?
History.
The history is more important. Another way to ask that is, which is more important? The life and deeds of Jesus or the books about him? His life and deeds. And we know that for a lot of reasons, but one is think about Peter. Did Peter need to read the Gospels to get saved? He didn't have those books. He still trusted in Jesus. Yes. So the history of those books is more important than the literature of those books. But to be fair, that's a little bit like asking, which is more important to you, your heart or your brain? Well, I'd like to keep them both. One is more important, but they're both vital, right? I mean, you can get a heart transplant. You cannot get a brain transplant. You'd be a different person if you got a brain transplant. You'd be a Frankenstein or something. But one is more important, but they're both very important. Another example of why the history is more important is from Matthew chapter 1. I've handed it out to you, a copy of it. You also might have a Bible with you you could look at. But Matthew chapter 1, if you look at it, if you just look at the first page there, the first thing you notice is what? It's a genealogy. Everybody's favorite part of the Bible is the genealogies. So why start with a genealogy?
Because you can prove the genealogy through secular writings and just documentation.
Okay, good. Dean?
I was going to say the same thing, to increase the credibility of the Bible.
Okay, good. Yes. Now, when it was originally written and people knew about these people, it would be much more powerful. I mean, to us today, it's a list of names. But, yes. Any other thoughts about that? About why start with the genealogy? Well, in the ancient world... Oh, were you going to say something?
Abraham started a Jewish nation, so they went back to Abraham, but that's where Jesus came to the Jews.
Right.
We're in that line too.
Yes. But you don't find that out till the book of Romans. No.
I mean genealogy.
What's that?
It sets the foundation of where Jesus' lineage came from.
Yes. And in the ancient world, a genealogy told who you are. Today, is our identity, the way you think of yourself, is it wrapped up in our genealogy? That's more of like, Ancestry.com, I'll check it out. That's interesting. But it doesn't really matter. I am who I am because of other things. That's the way we think of it. Right? Our identity today is wrapped up in, as much as we might not like to admit it, it's wrapped up in things like our neighborhood, our house, our car, the style of dress that we wear, and our hobbies. Now, you might be thinking, my identity is not wrapped up in those things, but I'm going to give a phrase, a two-word phrase, and tell me if you can name where this person lives, this type of person, how they dress, what they drive, what their hobbies are. Okay? Ready? Country boy. Drive a truck. What kind of pants do they wear? Jeans. What's one of their hobbies? Fishing. Hunting. Probably live in a rural neighborhood.
Probably have a lot of tattoos.
I think you might be getting thug mixed up with. Yeah. So now there's other things too. There's other, you could give other things. Yuppie, right?
Running a farm.
Yeah, but I mean, you sort of categorize people and even yourself. My wife is always saying, "Don't leave that in the car. People are going to think we're trashy." Right? She's very. That's like that would be our identity if there's that empty Walmart sack blowing around in our back seat.
So you leave empty Coke bottles in your car?
I have been known to do it on occasion, but I have learned that it's not good. So I no longer ever do that.
She gave you that book.
But in the ancient world, did they have hobbies?
Not really. All they did was work.
Life was much more difficult. So who their family was and who they came from was really hugely important to who they were.
When you think about it, isn't that the carpenter's son?
Yeah, they called him that.
That's how you identify him.
Yeah. So, another reason why to start with the genealogy is because Jesus came into our world tangibly in history with parents and a family and a hometown and a lineage into a nation, the Jewish people. Sometimes we think of Jesus as a concept and not as a person in history. Okay, so after we look through the genealogy, we come across this verse. It's printed there in your notes, 1:17. Can someone read that? It's in the Bible, and it's also there in your notes under number 5.
Thus there were 14 generations in all from Abraham to David, 14 from David to the exile to Babylon, and 14 from the exile to the Messiah.
So if you counted up all these names, how many do you think you'd come up with?
28.
What's that?
28.
28? Any other guesses? 42. Yeah. You'd think it would be 42. It's actually 41. Yeah, Matthew's fudging the numbers a little bit to get it come out neatly at 14s. That's okay. We'll talk about that. Let's look at this chart. So there's a lot of history leading up to Jesus. He doesn't just plop down, from outer space in the middle of no context. A lot of history leading up to him. Started going way back to Abraham, who lived roughly how long ago, based on your dates on that little chart there?
2,000 years ago.
4,000 years ago. 2,000 years before Jesus. And then another 2,000 years to get to us. So 4,000 years ago. It's a long time. That's when Abraham lived. And then, his great-grandson Joseph went to Egypt, and the whole family went to Egypt. And who led them out of Egypt in the red arrow? Whose name could you write in that red arrow? Moses. Moses led them out of Egypt. And then who led them into the promised land? Joshua. Okay, so to go from Abraham to what's the next thing after 14 generations? What does it say there? No, sorry, I'm being confusing. It says from Abraham to David is 14 generations. So where would David be on this chart? King, one of the early kings, while the little wishbone is still connected, right around 1000 BC. You can write, if you want, you can write David in there, or just a D, because it's a small space. Okay, and then from David to what is 14 more generations, according to that verse that's above the chart? To the exile of Babylon. So roughly around 500 BC. So 500 years later, another 14 generations go by. And then from the exile to Jesus, how many generations? 14. Okay. There's some odd things about that, but we'll get to that later. First, I have a question. Now we've covered one verse of all the gospel. If the history of a gospel is the important thing, then why are there 4 different accounts?
Because everybody views things differently, and if you're doing an investigation, you need more than one reference.
Okay. Yeah, good.
Different audiences.
Different audiences, good.
When I was a child, they explained that like if you were in an accident, you'd have the person who was driving one car, person the other, people around, the medical people, and so that's kind of the way they did. Each one had a
Different points of view.
point of view.
Yeah. God didn't give us the story of Jesus in the Bible as a list of facts about him. So the definition of literature is something written carefully for publication and not just information. So these books are arranged, each author arranged their book in a certain way for specific purposes. Now, John, we get to your point. For example, why does Matthew include a genealogy? Matthew and Luke include genealogies, but Mark and John do not. Why is Matthew's genealogy so very different from Luke's? In the way it's arranged. Matthew has those 3 categories of 14. In its length, how far back does Luke's genealogy go? Does it stop at Abraham? Goes all the way back to Adam.
Matthew's genealogy is primarily for the Jews, and that's why he only went back to Abraham.
There's another thing, the direction. Matthew starts in the old and goes down to Jesus. Luke starts with Jesus and goes back. Well, as you write, he's going back till he gets to Adam. So, there's all these differences, and they have reasons for it. It's not just happenstance. See, the problem with the witness account, Donna, is very good. But when you hear 3 different accounts of the same accident, often it's just because of differences in where they were standing. But these authors are doing it. Let's see, is it letter A? Because the genealogy is important for the point about Jesus that Matthew is making. That's why Matthew's is different. And that goes for everything. All the differences are for a purpose or for a point. Or points, plural. So, now if I and someone else tell the police about a robbery or something, we might say the story differently, not necessarily for any purpose though. It could happen that way. For example, imagine 3 people telling the police about a robbery, and they have 3 different purposes and points they're trying to make. One person says, "This is what happened, officer. Well, there's no street light on our corner, and no policemen were patrolling this neighborhood, and so the house was broken into, and the person was stabbed, and the guy got away. That's what happened." And that person has a purpose for the details they included. Right? They're trying to say, put up a street light, patrol this neighborhood more. Their purpose is to protect their neighborhood. Someone else maybe who's very concerned about justice says, the guy looks like this, and this is what he was wearing, and this is what he was driving, and that's the direction he went. They might include those details for their purpose. I want you to catch that guy. Someone else who's more concerned about the victim might include different details. The knife was rusty. Make sure you tell the ambulance that, because that's important for the doctors to know. They might include different details depending on the points they're trying to make. Does that make sense? So, when Mark chooses to include certain details or omit other details, that's important. Don't just say, here's this story, and then I'm going to fill in some details that I know from Matthew about that same story. Mark omitted those on purpose. Okay, so let's get back to the 14 generations thing. What do you notice? You can look at the genealogy in your Bible section, and you can look at verse 17. What do you notice about the genealogy of Jesus as Matthew presents it? Just some basic observations. Matthew chooses to include certain things.
He's including some of the mothers.
He includes 4 women. Is that unusual?
Yeah.
In a genealogy? It is. It is very unusual. Why might that be? Why those? I mean, obviously every single person on this list had a mother, but only 4 of them are mentioned. You notice?
Why did he say Solomon by the wife of Uriah?
Uriah, yeah.
It doesn't sound too good.
That was Bathsheba.
Yeah, that was Bathsheba.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Why does he say the wife of Uriah? He's exposing his sin.
That's true. That's part of Matthew's purpose. Well, we're skipping ahead here, but that's okay. But if you look ahead, let's see. We're not going to get to this for a bit, but we'll just take a sneak peek why he might have included it that way. He didn't say, and Solomon by Bathsheba. He wants to remind everyone that there was a murder involved. There was an affair involved in our great hero David. He says to Joseph, it's the end of chapter 1. Let's see here. You shall call his name Jesus because... there it is, 121. She will give birth to a son, and you will give to him the name Jesus, because he will save his people from their sins. Okay, good. What else do you notice about those 4 women that are mentioned?
They didn't have the best backgrounds.
They didn't have the best background.
Well, they had children
Okay, well, give me some examples.
Wasn't Rahab?
Rahab was a prostitute.
right?
Good. Another emphasis on the sin.
Sheba cheated on her husband.
Mm-hmm. Tamar pretended to be a prostitute so she could sleep with her father-in-law. Ruth was good. Ruth was by far the virtuous one of the 4.
What about
But-
Mary? She was too.
Well, I wasn't including Mary, as I was talking about the 4 that are mentioned along the line. But I do think these are leading up to Mary. But Ruth, did Ruth have any reason why some good, upstanding Jewish man might say, I'm not going to marry her?
She was an Amalekite, wasn't
A Moabite, yeah, right. A race who, does anyone know how the Moabite race started? Yeah, maybe remember Lot? After all the men were destroyed, his daughters, they got him drunk and slept with him so that they could have sons. And they named, one of them named her son Moab. Now you hear that Abba, which means from dad.
Really?
That's what Moab means. Mo is from, and Ab is father. So, every time you say, I'm a Moabitess, it's a reminder. So, anyway, okay, so we all have a little bit of potential what's the word for that?
Sins.
Not necessarily immorality, because Ruth didn't do anything wrong. It's not her fault. But there's that aspect.
Think of it this way, he didn't come from a saintly line.
Okay.
That's how the professor it says, you look at it, it's like a normal family, and there's always some skeleton in every closet.
In every closet, yeah.
Jesus didn't come from a saintly.
And this is building up to the it needs to be saved from their sins. That's the purpose of him coming. Now, what's something else? We did this sinful thing. What's something else about these 4 women?
They all turned out good.
This is a line in a Jewish family leading to a Jewish man, all coming from Abraham. But the women,
God used all of them.
all 4 of them are not Jews. Rahab was a Canaanite. Ruth was a Moabitess. Tamar was a Canaanite. And Bathsheba, while she may have been Jewish, her husband was Uriah the Hittite. So she was probably considered part of a Hittite family. Even though he was included in, he was one of David's mighty men, they were included in the nation of Israel. Now, put that detail together with the fact that this starts with Abraham. Abraham was promised what? Great nation. What else was he promised? That he would be a blessing to all nations. So, Starts with Abraham. Now, every Jewish person reading this list knows that. Abraham, they know, Abraham was, God promised that through him would come a blessing to all nations. Included in this line, the kingly line of David, there's all kinds of other nations in there. And this book is building to that theme, and it's going to get developed and developed until the big climax of the book, the way the book ends, is all about Jesus. The last thing Jesus ever says is what? In this book?
Go to all the nations.
Go therefore into every nation, all nations. So he's setting the stage to say that was the purpose from the start. Okay. So, save his people from his sins, part of the point of the genealogy. Going to all nations, culminating in the Great Commission, part of the point of the genealogy. Emphasis on David. David is the 14th. There's 14 in this number. David is the 14th from Abraham on this list. Why an emphasis on David? He was the king, and Jesus is descended from the line. He was the anointed king. Anointed, the Hebrew word for anointed is Messiah. Greek word for anointed, Christ. Messiah, the Christ. David was the anointed of God. And Jesus is the true heir to the kingdom. And then one last thing is emphasized in this list, and that's the exile. And so much of the Old Testament is centered around the exile and God's promises of judgment, and then God's promises to rescue his people, or at least a remnant, a faithful remnant from the exile. Jesus is the true heir of all those messianic promises. The Jews were not really looking for a Messiah until the exile. That's when all the... looking back, you can start to see hints of it all throughout, but there's no explicit or nearly no explicit references to a Messiah coming until the exile. So Jesus is heir to all those messianic promises of rescuing his people. Oh, and one last thing about the genealogy that we didn't cover about those women. That's, I think, building to Mary. God's mysterious providential work. Those stories of those women are bizarre and definitely providential. God's providence. The spies happened to be hidden in the house on the rooftop by this prostitute. And so she's the only citizen in all of Jericho who survives. And she happens to be in the line of Jesus.
The other thing is there was division in these families too. In other words, I get mad at you, I don't consider you part of my family anymore. And you had divisions going on where they're not of us, even though their background is, but they're not really us.
Are you thinking of like the Samaritans who were part Jewish? Yeah, that's definitely going on. We're going to get into some of that stuff more when we get our book, and I'll give everyone one, and we'll. It's not going to cost you anything, but you can give a $7 donation if you want, but you don't have to. It's really fine if you don't. Okay, so let's get down to Jesus. We already talked about Matthew 1:21. You are to give him the name Jesus because he will save his people from their sins. what name is Jesus? Don't Jewish people usually name a child after one of the ancestors? Have you noticed that?
The father.
Oh, it could be anyone in their line, in the father's family. So is Jesus an Old Testament name?
Jewish people don't have juniors though.
They don't say Junior.
The Spanish name, Jesus.
I think Jesus' name came before the Spanish name, if I know my history correctly.
It's a common name, right?
It's a very common name. I mean, think about when you're reading the New Testament, you got like so many Simons and, right? Simeon, one of the 12 tribes. You hear that Levi, one of the 12 tribes, they name after the Old Testament characters.
So where did Jesus come from?
What Old Testament character is Jesus? It sounds different. Joshua. It's the name Joshua. Over the course of time, it eventually became pronounced Hosea. So Hosea is the same name as Joshua. And by the time you get to New Testament times, and by the time you change the letters into Greek letters, it sounds like Jesus. But it is the same name. Joshua. And what does Joshua mean? Does anyone know? It means Yahweh saves. Now, it says you're going to give him the name Jesus or Joshua because he will save his people from their sins. Now, I think a helpful thing to do when you're reading the Bible, you're studying a verse, if it has the word save in it, try replacing it in your mind with the word rescue, which is the same word, but in English it has different connotations. It has different mental images. A rescue kind of saving is a lot different than I'm saving this. It's my last piece of candy. Right? Or you're going to throw out some stuff and you're like, you know what, I'm going to save this. I'll rescue it from the garbage can. You don't think of that as a rescue. So it can be helpful to think of it in such terms. So thinking of that, why this name? Mary and Joseph and the Holy Spirit could have chosen any name for him. Why not the name David? David was the godly warrior king who rescued Israel from the Philistines. Why not Ezra or Zerubbabel? They rescued the people out of exile in Babylon. Why not Moses? He rescued the people out of slavery. All these people saved their people. Why Jesus? Well, yes, let's look at Psalm 30, verse 8. And he, not referring to any human being, but referring to Yahweh. It's printed there in your notes, so you don't need to turn. Right under why Jesus. And he, Yahweh himself, will redeem Israel from all their sins. So Matthew's referencing Psalm 130, verse 8, to say it's not necessarily about the Old Testament character Joshua, although it is, but one of my points is to say it's about what that name means. Not that David rescues you, not that this new Messiah will rescue you the way David did, but that God himself will rescue you from your sins. If you look at all those other rescuers, they're all political, tangible, earthly rescuers. So, Jesus was not here to rescue them from the problems of this world, but from the problems of their own heart. So if your desire is for Jesus to save you or rescue you from an evil world, I hear that talked about a lot. Jesus is going to come back and rescue us from this evil world. Well, if that's what you want, if that's your desire, I think you should spend some time in prayer, because Jesus came to save us from our own evil selves and our own evil hearts. There is a tendency to talk about Jesus as the Jesus who heals marriages, the Jesus who puts families together, the Jesus who gives you wisdom and puts your life back together, and financial stability. That's not what Jesus came to do. Those are fringe benefits that sometimes happen for people who trust in Jesus. But what he came to save us from was not our messed up lives and our addictions. That's not what Jesus came to save us from. He came to save us from our sins. A fringe benefit is that often your life does go better because you start living through God's laws and through his wisdom. But often in history, people who believed in Jesus, their life went a lot worse than Pastor Brad in the movie. His life went a lot worse because he believed in Jesus. Didn't it?
Not really.
Not really. Well, anyway, the point is there are people who were persecuted, they were ostracized, they were tortured, they were martyred for their belief in Jesus. It didn't make their life any better. A lot of people, doesn't make their marriages any better. You go share the gospel with a Muslim woman, she becomes a Christian, is that going to improve her marriage?
No, not for kill her.
Yeah, it might not. Probably won't. You never know the results, but that's very important because we start to think of Jesus in terms of some of the fringe benefits as the focus. That's not the focus. The focus is that he saves us from our sins and our guilt. Okay, so what we can be in prayer about then is for God to give us a hunger and thirst after righteousness and not after comfort. How many of our prayers are really for comfort, for ease, right? I mean, I can think of many times when I say, God, please help this to go okay, because I know this could be a disaster. It could be here all day if this doesn't work out. Or I might not get the house I really, really want, so I'm really going to pray that I get the house and I get the price. Those desires for those things are very strong, but they're not what we're supposed to be desiring. What we're supposed to really, truly hunger and thirst after is righteousness. But we live in this world of all these other desires. And what do those other desires, the desires for other things, Jesus will say later, what do they do to the word in our hearts? They choke the word. Right? The worries of this life, the deceitfulness of riches, and the desires for other things choke the word, making it unfruitful. So easy to slip into that. Okay. When the angel said that to Joseph, a carpenter in the first century, when he said, you're going to give him the name Jesus because he's going to save his people from their sins, what would Joseph have understood by the words his people? The Jews. But even Joseph, growing up reading the Old Testament, I mean, there was no TV to watch. There was no paperback novels. Yes. The stories in the Old Testament were the stories. Even Joseph would have known that God often sends judgment to the evil, unbelieving Israel while rescuing only a faithful remnant. And this concept is going to get developed as the book goes. It's already started by mentioning Abraham and mentioning Uriah, who was a Hittite brought in to Israel as one of the Jews. And Matthew's already started developing that. And the next chapter is going to develop that much more with the Magi. And who are the first people to worship Jesus ever in history? Not Jews. The Magi. People from Babylon area. And then, of course, where does Jesus go immediately after that? To Egypt. Those are the two big things in chapter 2. Egypt and the East. So, it's much hard. Our concept of the world and how many nations there are is so large. But if you can, in your mind for a moment, put Africa and South America together, South America and Africa as one thing, okay, and put like all of Asia, Europe, it is one big landmass, right? And those are the two, especially if they were very culturally different. One cultural group from Asia, Europe, one from South America, Africa. And having the next chapter be about Europe, Asia, South America, Africa. I'm trying to say those are the two other Gentile areas. There's us. On one side we have Egypt. On the other side we have Babylon, Mesopotamia. I'm sorry if that's a strange thought experiment. What I'm saying is he basically includes everybody else as the way people thought of it at the time.
You gotta also think that Chaldeans had an impact from Daniel. When you think of Babylon, second.
Oh, yeah.
Egypt, the plagues, they had an impact, the Lord impacted on Egypt. So,
Yeah, those two nations, those two areas come into the Bible story again and again and again. You're right. All going all the way back to Babel and Joseph. Okay, so let's look at chapter 2, verses 2 and 3. Can anyone read? Might as well read 1, 2, and 3.
Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east and have come to worship him. When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him.
Okay, so what's a big contrast between verses 2 and 3?
The Gentiles were looking for the king, and the Jews were actually not. They're recognizing it.
Right. Good. Anything else?
One brought joy, one brought trouble.
Yes. Now, Herod's was not really a Jew. He pretended to be a Jew, but he was descended from Esau. But he kept Jewish things to help him for political reasons. But what's another contrast between Gentiles and Jews in these two verses? Other than not looking for him and not knowing about him.
The Jew was troubled, and the Gentile was elated, basically.
Yeah. Yes. We don't really get to the elation until, let's see, down in verse 10. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. But yeah. So there's a lot of preparation for this going to all nations. It's a huge theme in Matthew, and as someone said, I think it was Roy, about Matthew being written primarily to Jews, it does seem to be at least part of his audience is Jewish, because the Jews had a problem with thinking of themselves as, well, we're Jews, the rest of the world's going to hell, but we need to deal with our religion and our stuff. It's still, sadly, sometimes the attitude that if you have Jewish friends, that sometimes they feel that way. What's really important is them, their people. To be fair, everyone in the ancient world was that way. We think of, in our culture, racism is very bad. In the ancient world, racism was considered good and right, like the way we think of patriotism. Of course, you think your people are the best. Now, in the ancient world, also, your nation was your blood relatives. It wasn't, America's like a melting pot of peoples from other places, but there was nothing like that in the ancient world. Israel was supposed to have been the most inclusive nation on earth. Every time you're reading through those really exciting laws in Leviticus, I'm sure you all love reading that stuff, but they're always, they do this, and these laws are for you and the foreigners living with you. They're always included. And whether or not they kept to that, it's a different story.
One thing that's interesting is the wise men came from afar or distance, you know. The question is, how did they know, you know, they were looking for the Messiah? And I guess that goes back to the exile. David, they must have had some sort of information in the star letter.
Yeah, that's what John was talking about, potentially, Daniel, and then there's really only one reference to a star rising in the Old Testament, and that's from Balaam, who was a non-Jewish secular prophet, referencing a king coming when a star rises. So Balaam's writings would have potentially been available in the East.
The other thing important is the Magi didn't come to a manger, they came to a house. So that Jesus could have been as old as 2 years old before he
Yeah.
got there.
Yeah, there's a... That's the patriotism we're talking about. So there's a lot of obscurity to some of those details that we would like to know. Well, were the Magi and the shepherds there at the same time? Because in my little manger scene, they are. But was that historically accurate? Well, to be honest, it's unclear. There's a lot of unclear things about that. There's things that make you think that Mary and Joseph, they didn't just go to Bethlehem for the taxes, they actually moved there. There's some hints at that, and you're like, why would they move? There's a lot of things that are just left out. Because this is a work of literature, and what Matthew's purposes are not necessarily to set up a nice manger scene, but to tell us, to make points. And one of them is about this is going to all nations. It's not exclusive. So was fulfilled, let's see, this is, where are we at now? Number 12, but that is in verse, the end here, the very end, the last verse of chapter 2. Can someone read 2:23?
And he came and dwelt in the city called Nazareth, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the prophets. He should be called a Nazarene.
Okay. He shall be called a Nazarene. Does anyone, you know, sometimes when there's an Old Testament quotation, there'll be a little letter and it'll tell you where it's from? Does anyone know where that quote is?
It says Luke 1:26.
Well, that's not the Old Testament quotation.
Oh,
Luke wasn't written yet when Matthew wrote this, but
sorry.
it's okay.
Isaiah 11.
There's actually not an Old Testament passage that says he will be called a Nazarene. And if you think about it, if there was an Old Testament, like say Isaiah had written that, would Matthew have said, so was fulfilled what was said through the prophets, plural, if it was Isaiah? So what's going on there? Any guesses? I don't expect you to know, but it's fun to take guesses.
Well, the overall study would show you regions,
Okay.
genealogy, where David was.
Yeah, it does have to do with the overall study of all the prophets, putting them together. Matthew's giving a theology. Whenever you take information in two different verses and put them together to get something else, other information, that's called theology. Well, what do you know about Nazareth? How was it viewed?
It was viewed as despised and detestable.
Yeah. Can any good thing come out of there? Every place that you go has somewhere that's just, right? Like if you're in New Hampshire, how do they talk about people from Massachusetts?
Oh, yeah,
They-
I want to say the word.
Yeah. Everybody I know from New England is like, oh, Mass people, oh,
Why is that?
oh my word. You should, yeah.
Why is it? Why don't they like that?
I don't know. I've only been up there a couple times for concerts and things. I really don't know anything about it. But what about people from New York City? How do they view people from Jersey?
Oh,
There's always,
Forget about it.
Long Island, right? There's always somewhere where you're like, that's that bad place, right?
Well, you ever hear, they say, I'm from upstate New York. They don't identify themselves New York.
That's true. Yeah, people from New York City are like, those people from not in our city. And people not in the city are like, there's people in the city. But, so basically what little we know about Nazareth was that it wasn't highly esteemed for whatever reason. Can anyone think of Old Testament prophecies that say Jesus is not going to be highly esteemed?
Son of a carpenter.
Son of a carpenter?
I believe he was the son of a carpenter. They probably weren't the highest esteemed.
Oh, they weren't the highest esteemed.
Family ties.
Yeah. I have to think about that. I don't really know. But as far as Old Testament prophecies,
wasn't it in Isaiah, despised and rejected by men?
yeah, despised and rejected by men, and Wit said, Bethlehem Ephrathah, though you're small. Of course, that's not really about Nazareth, but it's still an aspect of the Christ is not going to come from a big, important place. Also in Isaiah 53, Joan, he'll have no form or comeliness, that when we see him, we should desire him. All those kinds of references is what Matthew is putting together to say he'll be called a Nazarene. There's a lot of other conjecture about that but
They did say, though, that he grew in wisdom and stature.
and in favor with God and man. Yeah. Yeah. That's the point Luke wants to bring out, though, not Matthew. Yeah. So just a real quick application here. We've already done some, but in your Bible study, it is best, because each author has their own purposes for including the details they include, not including other details, it's best not to read the Gospels back to back. I grew up, when I was reading the New Testament, I'd start in Matthew and read through until I eventually got to Revelation. But what happens when you do that, and probably most of us do that, is that all four Gospels blur together. Don't you, can you picture this conversation happening? You probably had this. Yeah, and one time Jesus did, I don't remember which Gospel it was in, but like somewhere in there I remember he healed a blind guy. Right? Or somewhere in there's some story about Jesus talking to a woman at a well. Can you relate to that? And part of that comes from reading them back to back, is that it blurs together. So it's best to read a gospel, maybe study that gospel, then move on to something else, an epistle, some Old Testament passage, then come back and read. It's not wrong to read them back to back, but it helps you keep them distinct in your mind. If you have some other way of doing that, that's great. I once printed out the book of Mark from my computer and put it all together on a big poster. Mark is pretty short. And so I could see the whole book at once. And every time I wanted to read Mark, I'd unroll that big scroll. I still to this day, this was 10 years ago, but I still to this day think of Mark in terms of where it is on that poster. Oh yeah, that was down in chapter 3. That's the way I think through Mark. But John, I took a whole semester class on the Gospel of John, and John's personally the Gospel I know the best, but I can think my way through the story. Oh yeah, and then he starts to develop this theme, starting in chapter 4. So it really helps to keep them distinct and to spend a lot of time on one. A good exercise might be to pick a gospel and just read it over and over again. You do that for a year. And at the end of that gospel, you'll think of that gospel as very different from the other three.
Jacob,
Yes?
John, he was actually there, right?
Mm-hmm. John and Matthew were eyewitnesses. Mark and Luke were not.
That's what I was going to ask you, which ones were there and which ones weren't. It was Matthew and John.
Yes. Another great exercise that I highly recommend, now you're going to think it sounds crazy, but is to read it all in one sitting. I would suggest Mark, because it's by far the shortest. But I, on a Sunday night when I was a pastor in Indiana, we just one service, instead of doing the service, we just read Mark. We had a little break halfway through and had some snacks. It took it was shorter than a movie, honestly, about an hour and a half. We just took turns reading it. It was great to get the whole picture. So, real quick, last little tidbit. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Yes, as we already pointed out, Matthew and John were the only two of the actual 12 apostles. Luke, anyone know anything important about Luke? Okay, good. Doctor, what else? I heard somebody say, yeah, traveled with Paul. You're reading through Acts. Luke wrote Acts also. You're reading through Acts, and it's like Paul did this, and then they did this, and then they did this. All of a sudden it says, and then we did this. And it gets to be we. So that's where Luke joined. So Luke traveled with Paul. If you had to group some together, some other similarities. Matthew and Luke both have the genealogies. These are the two. There's highly contested as to which gospel is first. These are the two. In ancient times, they thought Matthew was written first. In modern times, they think Mark is. But if you had to group some together, How would you do it?
Well, John would be last because he wrote some years after the other three.
Right. Scholars today think Mark was written first, but we don't really know.
What did you say about Mark?
Scholars today think Mark was written first.
I would group Mark and Luke together because they were both traveling with Paul on occasion.
Okay, yeah, Mark and Luke would be the non-eyewitness writers doing research. Those are definitely together. But if you had to join three together against one, who would you put with Mark and Luke? Matthew or John? John? Anybody else? There's only one other answer. It's actually Matthew. These three Gospels are called the synoptic Gospels. Syn is like synonym, same, optic, same view. These three Gospels are very similar to each other in many, 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 many ways. And John is very different in many, many, many ways. There are some things that all four, obviously, the very important things all four include. But
Luke for all the detail.
yeah, Luke is long-winded. Those chapters are like 80 verses long. And Luke does include some of the best, well, my personal favorite stories. The prodigal son and many of those. We'll get to that. We're going to focus in this class, we're going to focus on Matthew, but we're going to get to all four of them